Hey, Discovery listeners, I thought I'd watch some interviews post-season, Love is Blind Season 3. Let's get to it.
I'll just open-ended question. How do you see your experience?
So I'll say this. So you're exactly right. Living through it was one thing, and then watching it back was completely different. I think for me, watching it back, I definitely learned more than living through it. I think I felt like I was learning when I was living through it, but not until I was able to see like what I was doing, what I was saying, and how I was impacting the people that I love, specifically Nancy. And seeing myself do that was like, it was eye-opening. The initial emotions, I guess, I was feeling watching it back, like here on this TV, I was on my floor roll.
Okay, so this is the Nick Viall podcast on YouTube. I think you can also get it on other platforms as well, the audio podcast platforms. Nick is asking questions of Bartise. What was his experience? And it sounds like he was cringing as he was watching, I think that's what he's saying.
Going around just like, oh my God, what am I doing? What am I saying? Most times, for the first, I think 6 or 7 episodes, I was like embarrassed.
What specifically were you embarrassed about?
I think mostly just my brutal honesty and my lack of kind of understanding that what I'm saying and what I'm relaying, the information needs to be relayed to Nancy, but not the way that I did it.
Okay, I would imagine a lot of people would hope that he would see that and have some humility around it, which he's exhibiting. He's not blaming anyone for that. He's saying that he's rolling around on the ground, cringing, thinking, watching himself be brutally honest and overly honest. I wonder what he thinks about it, though, right? It's one thing to say, ooh, I can't believe I said that. It's another thing to contemplate, like, why did I say that? And why didn't I consider Nancy's feelings? Let's see if he can get into that.
And not how much I deeply dived into the whole Raven conversation or the pool conversation or in bed with Nancy talking about, what happened at the pool. So I think, on one hand, there's a sense of shame and a sense of embarrassment, but also I would never have lied. And I wanted to be as honest and open with Nancy because she needed to make a decision on who I am for herself at the altar.
Sure.
And so I would have wanted Nancy, and she was always honest with me. I'm not saying she'd lie, but I would always want somebody to be honest as opposed to being like fake or lying.
Okay. Well, hopefully Nick will ask something along the lines of, where's the balance between being honest and hurting someone's feelings, right? There's a way you can be honest about it and not be that hurtful, right? There's a way to tell someone. And, the way this show is engineered, in the real world, he just would have stopped dating her and certainly wouldn't propose to her that early, right? You start chatting, you really connect, you're like, oh my God, this is the one. You meet them, and Bartise would be like, yeah, I'm not really feeling it, the chemistry-wise, I don't know, or I'm just not attracted to her. What are you going to do? I guess I'll tell her. Hopefully you can tell someone, sorry, I'm not feeling it right now. I feel bad, but I just want to tell, I don't want to ghost you. I don't want to tell you otherwise. And so you tell someone, and, it's a part of dating, and it hurts. It's you feel bad when you do that sort of thing. Everyone suffers to some extent, particularly the person being rejected, right? But they wouldn't stay living together like they did on the show. And so I think for Bartise, he was in a strange scenario. Also, I think the producers, I'm just going to take a guess, total speculation, that the producers were encouraging Bartise to be even more honest or say more often what he was feeling on the inside, whereas if he was left to his own devices, he might have said those things, but not as unsympathetically. But at the same time, even if the producers were pushing him, he still did it, right? I imagine that the producers are pushing the cast members to do a variety of things, and I'm guessing the other cast members just wouldn't do that. They'd just be like, well, I don't want to say that on camera, or just internally they say, well, I know they're trying to get me to say this thing, but I'm not going to. But he still did it, right?
Do you think you crossed the line, I guess, between being honest versus, putting yourself in Nancy's shoes or being empathetic?
Yeah, I met Nick actually a while back. He was up in Seattle, and we had coffee and talked, and I found him to be a very thoughtful young man. I don't know how old he is, but I found him to be a very contemplative thinker. He's actually kind of shy, actually, in a way, but nice person. I don't know much more than what I interacted with very briefly, but also when I've watched his show before, reacted to it, I've noticed that he is similar to a therapist, or he thinks similarly to me, the kinds of questions he asks, which is a rare treat for me because often on the reunions and the tell-alls, I'm wanting the host, Sean, or I can't remember, the Nick Latchkey or something. I don't know their names. They, Vanessa, and anyway, the two of them, I'm always trying to mentally will them to ask the question that I'm curious about, and they almost never ask that question, or they did and they edited it out or something. But Nick asks the question I was exactly thinking. So let's see what he says here.
I would have felt much worse if Nancy had said this to me than I felt watching myself do it. Like I felt so bad watching it back and just hearing myself go into detail. And I think that's where I draw the line. The extent of where I went with the information and like even reenacting a scene in bed together, that was way too far. So I think what I would do differently is say, hey babe, this is a struggle for me, and here's where I'm at. I don't need to go into all the detail.
I don't know. It sounds like he is at a beginning. I don't know, obviously, but it looks like he is at the beginning stage of his emerging insight and understanding and maturity regarding this whole issue. Because I'm guessing that this is an ongoing issue for him. I don't know that, obviously, but usually these kinds of behaviors aren't, anomalies. They usually are indicative of a pattern. So he is, I think, basically concluding. So he's cringing. He's like, "Oh, that does," and I wonder what he's cringing about. I think, and I hope, but it sounds like he's cringing about feeling bad for Nancy, feeling like, "Oh, I can't believe I said that to her. That must have really hurt her feelings." And I think that's what he's saying. Because another possibility, which would be more worrisome, is if he was cringing because he looked foolish. Right? That's a different kind of cringe. But I think it's the first one. We'll hope it's the first one. And so then he concludes, I just should have said less, is what he's basically saying. But what I would hope that he would graduate to eventually, and there's some phases there, of not just pulling back, but just holding in your heart someone else's feelings. And it is a maturity thing. It is something that people gain with age. And when you turn 18 as an adult, legally, that's not when you are done maturing. Newsflash. You mature throughout your life. And if things are going well enough for the individual, then their ability to empathize will increase over time. Not that 18-year-olds can't have empathy, but a part of empathy, a big part of empathy, is not just caring about other people or loving other people, but having enough experiences where you actually have gone through what someone else is going through right in front of you. When Bartise is doing that to Nancy, there's a possibility that he has limited or never gone through an experience where someone is saying something along those lines to him and making him feel terrible about himself. I don't know. Who knows? Or he has, and he's cut himself off from that or something. But the older you get, presumably the more therapy you get, that kind of thing, the more feedback you get, the more experiences you have. And that's what it is like for me. For example, with me as a feminist, in the beginning of my feminist adherence, when I was in my 20s, I intellectually was on board with the notions of sexism and prejudice and bias and mistreatment. And I believed the research because there was, mountains of it. And I heard the stories and I took people's word for it, but I didn't really feel it. And I still don't really feel it because I'm not a woman, but I've heard so many stories from women about what they go through as they are being targeted with misogyny and sexism. And because I care about these people, I feel more and more the reality of what it is like for women as they go through this. And when I look back at myself when I was in my 20s, I didn't really get it. It took me a while to really hear it. So when you want to understand a different group's experience with oppression, or just a different group's experience in general, you have to listen a lot. You have to hear a lot of real stories, and you have to really hear them. You can't just filter it through your own filter. So for Bartise, it's possible that he just doesn't really feel it. He understands maybe intellectually he shouldn't have said those things, but he doesn't really feel it. Because if he really felt it, one, he wouldn't have said it that way. He could have said the point of what he was trying to get across, like, I don't know if I'm feeling it with you. But there's a way to say it, like, why bring up Raven at all, right? There's really no reason to bring up her. That's pointless. Raven's engaged with someone else. Why would you give Nancy a complex about that? Two, there's a way of telling someone that you're not into them in a way that takes care of them, in a way that asks them questions. You know, like when he was being brutally honest when they were laying in bed together, he could have said something like, how are you doing? Like, I just laid a big thing right there, and how are you feeling? Does that bother you? Does that hurt I don't want to hurt your feelings. Something like that. There was almost no awareness there about that. I don't know if that's indicative of his personality or they edit it in a certain way, but I would hope that he would eventually. So I don't know, but just based on that, the cure, the remedy is for him to go to Nancy, if she's up for it, and really hear how it affected her, and for him to really listen. And maybe part of Bartise would be like, I think she's taking it a little far, whatever. But most of what Nancy's telling him, he would really internalize and be like, oh, okay. Or to identify times in his life where he felt rejected, maybe in a different way, where he felt like he wasn't good enough in someone else's eyes, and to really remember what that felt like and to transpose that onto that situation or other situations that he might be in the future. And I guess another remedy would be for him to be rejected. Maybe going through this show has that corrective experience where the internet rejects you, you feel like you're a piece of crap, and you're like, oh, this must be how Nancy felt. Wouldn't that be interesting if that was some kind of poetic justice for a lot of these shows?
Those and all the names that I was calling everybody.
Did Nancy ask you first, or did you open up about like the physical aspect of Raven? Like, how did that conversation even get started?
Oh, shoot, man. Another thing I'll say, don't have these conversations. I would not have these conversations drunkenly between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. So that's one thing. I can't remember who brought it up.
You were drinking while you guys were having these conversations?
Oh, you couldn't tell my eyes, man? My eyes were like this the whole time. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I said that at the time with a variety of cast members on a variety of seasons of Love is Blind, that alcohol is fed to these individuals because I'm total speculation guessing that the producers absolutely know or surmise that alcohol will make things more exciting. It doesn't take a genius to imagine that to be true. And so he's saying, if I could go back in time, I wouldn't have had those conversations while I was intoxicated. Yeah. And we can use that as a jumping off point. Now, it can go either way. I've seen couples, or I've heard from couples, and I guess seen, that when they have a little bit of intoxication, whether it's marijuana or alcohol or something, it can actually loosen them up and give them the ability to talk about things that otherwise would be too anxious for them, potentially. I'm not, as a therapist, prescribing that people become intoxicated. That's not what I'm saying, but that's what I've heard from people. And I've heard way more often that even with a little intoxication, but particularly with moderate to severe intoxication, that people will not say and do things or interpret things the way they would normally. There's a huge myth out there that somehow the phrase, a drunk man's words is a sober man's thoughts. And that is just not true, because a drunk man or a drunk human, their brain isn't operating in a way that is normal. You can actually say and do things that are completely separate from your personality, have really nothing to do with any suppressed idea or thought or emotion. Certainly that can happen, right? You can become more uninhibited and say things that you've always wanted to say. It depends, obviously. But your ability to understand what someone else is telling you, your ability to hold memories in your mind it's all impaired. Your working memory can become extremely impaired, such that if you've ever talked to someone that was extremely intoxicated and you tell them something and they're like, oh, okay. And then literally 2 seconds later, they don't remember what you just said. They're like, wait, what was that? It's because there are certain functions of the brain that are literally offline. They're not working because there's so much impairment. There's so much slowing down of the nervous system processes and in the brain. And so certain things just can't operate functionally. So yeah, we could make sure. So the thing is to know for yourself what tends to happen when you're intoxicated and make decisions accordingly. And when in doubt, don't talk about sensitive things when you're intoxicated.
We just met.
True. No, I don't remember who brought it up, but I remember she had said something like, I talked with SK today. He's not my type. So it's like, it's a no for me. And I was like, oh, well, I talked to Raven. I had the opposite experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, it seems.
So, he's equating, it's like, well, Nancy said that she talked to SK and connected with him in the pods and met him and realized that SK wasn't her type. And so, yeah, I was just participating in the conversation. No, you weren't. It was it's possible that Nancy was saying that because she wanted to reassure you that she was into you. You're not just talking about something that doesn't have any bearing on the other person, right? So you're not just like, anyway, hopefully that cringe feeling that he felt will give him the motivation to explore. I'll talk about for myself. When I was around his age, I don't know how old he is, but when I was in my mid-20s, I started, to study to become a therapist, and I started to dive into therapy more. I'd been in therapy before, but I decided to do more in-depth therapy myself. And at the time when I was 24, I was wanting a therapist that would, quote unquote, kick my ass. I wanted someone that would really go after me, someone that didn't, quote unquote, make me feel good about myself. I didn't want someone to make me feel bad about myself, but I didn't want someone to pull any punches with me. I don't know why I wanted that precisely, but I think it was wise that I wanted that, and I was referred through friends, a therapist that absolutely was like that. He went for it, and when I remember, and I'm feeling it now, driving to therapy, my hands would be sweating. I would notice that my nervous system was starting to get ready for fight or flight because of the way that he made me feel. He wasn't abusive, but he made me cringe about myself in therapy. I would tell him stories, and he would poke at something and be like, okay, well, do you see what you're telling me there? I'd be thinking I'm just telling him a story about my life, and that he'd say like, oh, interesting, or I support you or something. I mean, I wasn't trying to lob a ball over the plate so he could hit a home run. I was just trying to tell him stories, and then he would find things because I'm 24 and I don't know anything, and I have limited insight at that point. And so when he would point those things out, I would go, oh, and that feeling, I was at a crossroads, right? I could have dropped out of therapy. I wasn't mandated to be in therapy, and it was expensive too. My insurance didn't cover it at all, and I was not working much because I was a student and just getting student loans. So it was a hardship. So I could have easily dropped out of therapy and said, I'll do it later or something. I don't have time or the money, or I don't know, this doesn't make me feel good. So I reached this Y in the road, and I decided, no, this is what you got to do. If you're cringing, that means something. That means there's an opportunity. It means that something is wrong that you need to address. It doesn't mean you run away. It means that something is there for you to grow. If there are no things that you're cringing about, if there's no tension there, then you're either perfect as a human being, or you're not getting into stuff that is your learning edge, as people will say. And so I said, no, I'm going to stick it out. And so I would sweat on the way to therapy every week. And I would hope that for him, he would utilize that in the same way, that he would see it in the same way, that it's a Y in the road for him. The cringing is an indication that maturity opportunities have arrived. All right, well, that is it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.